Ari, thank you for that stand-up moment. I think we should, I think you should have a radio show. I think that's the next CSP program I'd like to see and hear. So before we begin, Ari has asked me to share a piece of art each time we meet. So here's a piece of art, a digital painting. It's a combination actually of a painting and a photograph. I'm going to make it full screen. And this is a photograph of my daughter when she was young, running in a field, and I kind of integrated that into a painting of a field, and it's called Play. And tonight we're going to explore play. We're going to see some of the direct experience that the early Hasidim, and especially the Maggot of Mezaridge and his students, emphasized. Last time we learned about the Baal Shem Tov, and I shared with you that the Baal Shem Tov passed away in 1760, and by 1772, when the Great Maggid of Mezritch passed away, he's our primary character for tonight, there were Hasidic communities all around Eastern Europe. And so in the 12 years between the Baal Shem Tov's passing and the Maggid's passing, a lot happened. We're going to look at those 12 years tonight. And before we begin, I want to share with you a nigun, a wordless melody of Rabbi Yitzchak of Berdichev, one of the students of the Maggot of Mezritch, one of the greatest of the Hasidic masters. So I'm just going to sing it for a minute, and I invite you to close your eyes and listen to the nigun. You can sing along if you'd like, but also listen to your own mind and heart as you listen to the nigun, as you listen to the melody. Didai didai ambayam, didai anayam, didai dam dayam, didai 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 dam, didai 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 dam, didai dam bayam. Ay, 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 di-di-di-da-di-dum, di-da-di-da-di-dum, di-di-di-da-di-da-di-dum, ay, 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 di-da-di-da-di-dum. Didai 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 dum, didai 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 dum, di ya 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 yum. Didai 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 dum, didai 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 dum, didai didai ya. So the Hasidim would sing this for hours at a time, particularly during the third meal of Shabbat, which is a time of dvekut, a time of deep immersion in connection to the oneness of reality. And there are different kinds of songs in the Hasidic world. Some of them are much more joyous and uppity, hoppity, hippity, jump up and down, celebration kinds of songs, and some of them are very contemplative. This one is a very contemplative song, and it's appropriate because we need to look at the central teachings of the generation after the Baal Shem Tov. The Baal Shem Tov, we saw, was the founder, but he wasn't really a founder of a movement. He was a storyteller. He was a wild, traveling storyteller and a shamanic healer. He wasn't an organizer. And we find in history and Jewish history that many times you have a very charismatic leader who's a storyteller or a healer or a preacher of some sort, a teacher of some sort, but who doesn't have the organizational skills to develop the structures around the teachings and turns to someone else to play that role. So the Baal Shem Tov was that wild, creative sparker, igniter of fires, of souls on fire. The Maggid, Rabbi Dr. of Mezritch, was the organizer, was the one who created the structures around the Baal Shem Tov's teaching. So we're going to see a text first, and I hope you can all see this. This is from a later, much later Hasidic text. This is the introduction to a book called the Beit Yaakov, the House of Jacob, by the second Rebbe, the second master of Ishbitz. In our very last session, we're going to learn about the Kotzker Rebbe. We're going to find out that his best friend was the Ishbitzer Rebbe. And later in life, they had a tremendous break between these two friends. They moved in very different directions. They're both great masters. They disagreed with each other about a lot of things. This is the son of the Ishbitzer Rebbe writing, let's say, 5 generations after the Great Maggid of Mezritch, whom we are going to explore tonight. And the Beit Yaakov, Rabbi Yaakov Leiner of Ishbitz, writes, the greatest student of the Baal Shem Tov was the Great Maggid. And someone in Sefaria beautifully added the definition of a Maggid. Maggid was a title for a traveling preacher who would travel from town to town, give inspiring sermons to light the fire of the souls of Israel. So that sounds a little bit like the Baal Shem Tov, doesn't it? The Baal Shem Tov traveled around telling stories, lighting people up. But a Maggid was actually a role in the Jewish community. There were rabbis and there were Maggidim. A Maggid, plural of Maggid. A Maggid was paid by the community, was supported by the community, had a certain route, like the postman or postal employee has a certain route that may include your home, but not the next block over. So a Maggid also had a certain route that included certain towns and villages and not others. And the great Maggid, Rabbi Dr. of Mezritch, was the greatest student of the Baal Shem Tov. After the passing of the Baal Shem Tov in 1760, his students accepted the great Maggid as his successor and continued to learn the paths of divine service from his teachings. Okay, now the Rabbi Jacob Leiner of Ishbitz says that as if it's simple, but it wasn't simple at all, because after the passing of the Baal Shem Tov, there was a question about who would succeed the Baal Shem Tov, who would become the primary leader of the next generation. There was some tension over this. If you remember last time, I shared 2 stories with you about rabbis who were at first opposed to or skeptical of the Baal Shem Tov, and then they became students of the Baal Shem Tov. Do you remember the rabbi who was angry because no one was coming to synagogue in the morning? And the Baal Shem Tov told him a story about a horse and loosening the reins, and then he became a convert, so to speak, to this new movement. That was Rabbi Yaakov Yosef of Polnoya. And the other story I told you was about the Maggid himself visiting the Baal Shem Tov. The Baal Shem Tov handed him the book of Kabbalah, of mysticism, and said, read. The Maggid read, but the Baal Shem Tov took the book and read himself, and then the room was filled with the rushing of wings, and the angels were appearing. And the Baal Shem Tov said, you know how to read, but your reading lacks soul. So if you remember these 2 stories, I shared them last time because I wanted to emphasize now that those 2 students of the Baal Shem Tov were both in the running to succeed the Baal Shem Tov. And there was a question about it for a little while after the Baal Shem Tov's passing. And the Maggid, Rabbi Dr. was accepted by most of the students, but not all of the students. And some of the students and some of the companions of the Baal Shem Tov preferred Rabbi Yaakov Yosef to be the successor. But here it's presented as if the Maggid became the successor without any controversy. He's glossing over the controversy a little bit. And it's true that he became the predominant, the primary successor of the Baal Shem Tov. And he continued to teach the teachings of the Baal Shem Tov. And among his greatest students, among the Maggid, Rabbi Dov Ber's greatest students, were Reb Menachem Mendel of Vitebsk, who later traveled with about 300 or 400 Hasidim to the land of Israel. They established the first Hasidic enclave in the north of Israel, in Tiberias, and some of them in Sfat. And among the students of the Maggid were Reb Eli Melech and his brother Reb Zushia, and Reb Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev, whose song we just sung and who we're going to hear about a little bit later on. And also Rabbi Yaakov Yitzchak, the seer, the prophet of Lublin, and Rabbi Yisrael of Kozhenitz, and Reb Shneir Zalman of Liadi, who was the first of the Lubavitcher Rebbes, and Reb Chaim Chaikel of Amdur, and Reb Shmelke of Nikolsburg, and Reb Pinchas, who wrote the Hafla'ah. So this is a list of students in the circle of the Maggid. They were all very different, as we will see. But before we talk about the students of the Maggid, we have to talk about the Maggid himself. The Maggid was very different than the Baal Shem Tov. The Maggid was much more inclined toward asceticism. The Baal Shem Tov, remember, emphasized joy and emphasized service of God, service of the divine through anything, through eating, through drinking, through celebration, through singing and dancing. The Maggid was much more inclined to focus on the traditional religious practices of Torah study and contemplative prayer. But now that I said that, you should have a question, because I told you that the Hasidim, the Baal Shem Tov, was different, and actually in stark contrast to the rabbinic elite, the academic rabbinic elite, who emphasized the traditional practices of Torah study and traditional liturgical prayer. Remember, in the first session, we talked about how the Jewish community was devastated by two cataclysmic events, the pogroms of Khmelnytsky and then the false messiah Shabtai Tzvi, and that as a result of the latter cataclysm, the rabbis became very suspicious of anything mystical. So they retreated into the study of law and the academic study of Talmud, the intellectual. And the Baal Shem Tov came to challenge that and say that it's not only about the head, it's also about the heart, and it's also about the feet. It's about dancing. It's about how you walk in the world. It's about the hands and what you do with your hands. It's about the instrument that you play, or the knitting that you do, or the writing, the poetry that you write, or anything that you do to express yourself is part of the divine service. So when I tell you that the Baal Shem Tov's primary successor emphasized Torah study and prayer, you could ask, well, how is he different then than the opponents of the Hasidim who emphasized Torah study and prayer? And in order to answer this question, I have to tell you a story. And it's one of my favorite stories because it really captures the essence of Hasidism and the essence of the Maggid. There was a young man who was a student in Lithuania. Lithuania, as you may recall, was the center of anti-Hasidic activity, the center of the academic focus on Talmud study and legal studies. And this young man was ensconced in that world, in the world of study, in the world of Talmud, in the world of the legal codes. But he heard that not that far away, there were other Jews who were very serious about their Judaism, who were singing, who were dancing, who were experiencing mystical states. And he was very curious about that. He wanted to go visit. So he went to his teacher. His teacher, according to legend, was the famous genius of Vilna, the Vilna Gaon, Rabbi Elijah the Vilna Gaon, who would become the leader of the anti-Hasidic movement in Lithuania, who was an incredible scholar, who, according to tradition, never left his attic because he was always hunched over a book studying, who kept his feet in ice water to keep him awake studying all night, who would hold a candle in his hand while studying so that if he dozed off, the candle would burn down and wake him up. He was completely dedicated to the study of Talmud and also mysticism, actually, but in a different way than the Hasidim. And so our protagonist, our young man, went to his teacher, the Vilna Gaon, and he said, Master, I want to go check out the Maggot of Mezaridge. I've heard great things about him. The Vilna Gaon said, what? You want to go visit those ne'er-do-wells, those batlanim? Batlanim is people who are wasting their time. You want to go visit them? It's a waste of your time. Don't go. The student said, Master, I just feel like I have to check it out. So the Vilna Gaon said, okay, if you need to go, so go. But I want you to bring a question in the Talmud, a very difficult question in the Talmud, to the Maggid, to Rav Dov Ber, the Maggot of Mezritch. And I want you to ask this question. This is a question that that everyone I've asked has failed to answer. So the student said, okay, he traveled for a week or so to visit the Maggot of Mezritch. He got to Mezritch, where the Maggid lived. He went in to see Rabbi Dr, the Maggid, and he asked him several questions, and at the end, and he was very impressed, and at the end he asked the question of his master, the Vilna Gaon. He asked the very complex, like graduate level, postdoc level question in Talmud that no one had been able to answer yet. And the Maggid answered the question elegantly, quoting 8 sources and weaving them together into a beautiful tapestry of understanding. And the student was really, really impressed by this and surprised, because his teacher, the Vilna Gaon, had told him this question is very difficult. No one's been able to answer. So he went back to the Vilna Gaon and he reported to his teacher that the Maggid had answered the question. And the Vilna Gaon said, oh, which sources did he quote? And the student told him the sources that he quoted, and there was one of the 8 sources that was the critical component in the answer. It was the linchpin of the whole answer. And it was in the Jerusalem Talmud. And the student told this to the Vilna Gaon, and he opened the Jerusalem Talmud and he showed the student the original source. And he said, you know, this was indeed a difficult question, but the truth is, you shouldn't be so impressed. It's here in the Jerusalem Talmud, for anyone who's really paying attention. And the fact is, all the other people I asked weren't really paying attention. This is a hard question, but it's the kind of question that any great scholar should be able to answer. So the student was now very disappointed, because he had built this up in his mind as an incredible display of the Maggid's scholarship that could compete with his own teacher's scholarship. So he traveled back to Mezritch, and he came to the Maggid, and he said, you know, Rabbi Dr, the Maggot of Mezritch, I went back to my teacher, and I told him your answer to the difficult question, and he showed me that it's actually in the Jerusalem Talmud. So I don't understand, why should I be impressed by your scholarship? And the Maggid said to him, no, my son, your master knows it from the Jerusalem Talmud, but I know it from the place that the Jerusalem Talmud knows it from. Your master knows it from the book. I know it from the place that the book learned it. And of course, according to this legend, the student became a follower of the Maggot of Mezritch. This story is telling us something very important about this moment in Hasidism. It's telling us something very important about the Maggid. It's also telling us something very important about our Jewish life today, and any spiritual life today, which is that there's a vast difference between knowing something from the book and knowing something from the source, between intellectual knowledge and experience. And the Maggid, in fact, emphasized experience over all else. And there are many stories about this, of the students who flocked to Mezritch, among them great scholars, but also simple Jews. And many of them reported the same thing. Many of them said, for example, when asked, what did you find in Mezritch, one of the students of the Maggid, who would later become a great master in his own right, said, when I went to Mezritch, I learned that there's a God. And the person asking him said, you learned that there's a God? Everyone knows there's a God. What's the big deal? He said, no, everyone says they know there's a God. But in Mezritch, they really know it. In Mezritch, I really knew it for the first time. And there's another famous story that's often quoted of a student who was asked, why did you go to Mezritch? Did you go to study Talmud? He said, no. Did you go to study mysticism? No. Did you go to study the law? No. Did you go to hear stories? No. Why did you go to visit the Maggid? I went to the Maggid to see how he ties his shoelaces. This is a very famous quote in the Hasidic world. I went to see how he ties his shoelaces. And some places in the Hasidic world today, if you say that, they will know that you're referring not only to the Maggid, but to an approach that emphasizes experience and the witnessing of great teachers in their daily life. not just when they're on the stage, not just when they're on the pulpit, not just when they're giving a sermon in synagogue, not just when they're conducting a wedding, but how does the rabbi behave when no one's looking? And what happens when the rabbi or any religious leader is dealing with the kinds of things that we all deal with as human beings? What happens when the Maggid has to tie his shoelaces? That's what I wanted to see. So there are many stories about this, the emphasis on direct experience. And this is how the Maggid was different from the Lithuanian Misnagdim, the opponents of the Hasidim. They both emphasized Torah study. They both emphasized traditional liturgical prayer. But the Misnagdim, the opponents of the Hasidim, emphasized an intellectual, academic, kind of second-hand approach to Jewish ideas. Now I'm simplifying here because the Misnagdim themselves had deep spirituality through study. And for them, study was a spiritual experience. But in comparison to the Hasidim, they de-emphasized direct religious experience in favor of what's written in the texts. And the Maggid emphasized learning not from the texts, but from the source of the texts. There's a beautiful Hasidic teaching from a later master that says, you know, if someone gives you a gift and you don't really like that person very much, so when they give you the gift, you'll look at the gift. You'll look at the gift. But if someone gives you a gift and you love them very much, you won't look at the gift, you'll look at the person giving you the gift. So when God gives us the Torah, the Misnagdim, the Lithuanians, the intellectuals look at the gift, they look at the Torah. And the Hasidim, who are in love with God, look, so to speak, look at God. They look to the source. And that direct experience is what drew all of these young scholars and seekers from all around Eastern Europe to Mezritch. And it's also what alarmed the Lithuanian intellectual elite, because suddenly we have a movement of people who are using the language of direct religious experience. Direct religious experience can be very powerful, but it can also be very wild and chaotic. It can be antinomian or against the law. What if I have a direct religious experience that tells me I have to break the law? And I'm relying on the inner authority of that experience. So that's dangerous to a religious community. And it was scary and alarming to the Lithuanians. And so we find that in the year 1772, the Lithuanians, the Misnagdim, led by the Gaon of Vilna, who we met earlier, Rabbi Elijah, Rabbi Eliyahu, the Vilna Gaon, they declared that the Hasidim are under a ban of excommunication. And there's a famous story, a sad story about this, about the end of the Maggid's life. We're going to come to that a little bit later. But before we get to that excommunication and the conflict between the Hasidim and their opponents, we have to understand what the Maggid actually did to craft a movement out of the Baal Shem Tov's teachings and out of his charismatic figure. How did the Maggid do this? So we know now that the Baal Shem Tov traveled around igniting souls. We know that the Maggid was a teacher who emphasized direct experience and attracted students from all over Eastern Europe. But here's the brilliance of the Maggid. Here's the essential characteristic of the Maggid. The Maggid was an expert master educator and mentor who saw the potential, the unique potential of each one of his students and knew how to guide each student in a different way. And then, even more important, to which community to send each of the students to establish a bastion of Hasidism. So remember, we're talking in a period when there's a very tremendous, deeply entrenched emphasis on study and a skepticism of mysticism and direct experience. And the Maggid knows that the teachings of the Baal Shem Tov really deserve to spread across Eastern Europe, if not further. So what he did was he attracted all of these students. He trained them in spiritual practices, but he guided them in very different ways. And then he sent them out to different places across Eastern Europe to establish a center of Hasidism. And so among the students of the Maggid, we find tremendous diversity. We just saw some names in the text that I shared earlier. For example, we find Reb Zusha of Anipol, the famous Reb Zusha who in the Hasidic world, in the Jewish world, when you hear the name Reb Zusha, you have to smile. Reb Zusha is known as the holy fool of Hasidism. He was simple. He didn't emphasize learning. He may not have been learned himself. And in fact, there's a story about this too. They asked Reb Zusha, or they asked actually his brother, Reb Elimelech, another Hasidic master, why doesn't your brother Zusha ever really teach any of the teachings of your master and his master, the Maggid? He never really teaches. He doesn't teach Torah. Why not? Reb Elimelech said, well, it's very simple. When we were in the Maggid's school, the Maggid's center, the Maggid's academy, the Maggid's training quasi-monastery, we don't have monasticism in Judaism really, but this is about as close as you can get. The Maggid would start teaching Torah. And when the Maggid would start teaching Torah, he would quote from the Bible. And he would start by saying, it says in the Torah, Vayomer Hashem el Moshe lemor, and God spoke to Moses saying, and then he would continue and keep reading the verse and the next verse, and then give a discourse on it, and unpack it, and interpret it, and reveal the secrets of the Torah through this verse and these verses. My brother Reb Zusha, as soon as he would hear those words, Vayomer Hashem el Moshe lemor, and God spoke to Moshe saying, he would start repeating the words quietly to himself, and God spoke to Moshe saying, and God spoke to Moshe. God spoke to Moshe, and he would start repeating it louder and louder, and he would start screaming the words out loud, and he would get into a kind of religious ecstasy that God spoke to a human being, and we would have to lock him in the shed outside so he wouldn't disturb the rest of us. So Reb Zusha never heard the Maggid's teachings, because as soon as the discourse started, he was in ecstasy already. That's why Reb Zusha never taught Torah of the Maggid. That's Reb Zusha on the one hand. On the other hand, among the students of the Maggid, we have Reb Shneur Zalman of Liadi, the Alter Rebbe, the oldest Rebbe of the Lubavitcher Hasidim. So I'm sure you all know the Lubavitcher Hasidim today. The founder of that movement was Reb Shneur Zalman, and Reb Shneur Zalman was a great scholar in his own right. In fact, he wrote a book of law, a code of Jewish law that was deeply rooted in the tradition of Talmud study and study of the legal codes and making halachic decisions for communities. And it was the highest level of a legal code book that was produced in that time. It was accepted by a lot of people. And it rivaled the actual code of Jewish law, the Shulchan Aruch, the famous unifying code of Jewish law that was written centuries earlier. And so he was a tremendous scholar. The Maggid sent Reb Shneur Zalman of Liadi to Lithuania to establish a Hasidic community in Lithuania among, or very close to, the Misnagdim, the opponents, because he knew that Reb Shneur Zalman could hold his own in conversation or dialogue with the scholars, the academics, the intellectual elite in Lithuania, because Reb Shneur Zalman himself was a great scholar. He knew that if he sent Reb Zusha there, it would be a massacre. You know, the scholars would have nothing to do with this simple Jew who had such capacity for ecstasy of the soul, but couldn't quote the codes of Jewish law in the way that Reb Shneur Zalman could. So that was the Maggid's brilliance. He knew who his students were. He didn't have a cookie cutter approach to education. He sent each person through a different training program, so to speak, and eventually to a different community in Eastern Europe. Not all of those were successful matches, but enough of them were that by the time the Maggid passed away in 1772, we find the students of the Maggid have now established Hasidic communities even in Lithuania, in Galicia, in Poland. Reb Zusha's brother, Reb Elimelech, who told us the story about Reb Zusha, went to Poland, established the first Hasidic community in Poland, created generations of Hasidic masters in Poland. We're going to come back to them in our last session with the Rebbe of Kotzk, who's a great, great grand student of Reb Elimelech. And so if you look at the map of Eastern Europe, which is worth spending some time with, you start to see that the beginnings of the movement, and I'm going to share it with you, I'm going to just hold it up from Professor Wiesel's tremendous book, Souls on Fire, in the back of the book, and we can send this out afterwards so you can look at it on your own. But you can see how the movement spread from, hold on, let me just move so I can see myself. Okay, from, can everyone see this somewhat? So where my finger is Mezhibaj, where the Baal Shem Tov had his center. And right up here is Mezaridge, where the Maggid had his center and his school for training the next generation of Hasidic leaders. And then all the other dots on the page are the places across Eastern Europe where the Maggid students established centers and Hasidic communities. So tremendous growth. I mean, it spread like wildfire. And it spread like wildfire because of the Baal Shem Tov's message, yes, but also because the Maggid had a genius for organizing and sending people on shlichus, or shlichut, which is a mission. Your mission is to go to Poland. Your mission is to go to Lithuania. You're going to have a lot of opposition there. And in fact, Rav Shneur Zalman of Liadi, who went to Lithuania, was informed upon by the opponents and was jailed and had to flee. It wasn't a simple mission, but he did establish a bastion of Hasidism even in Lithuania, and Rebbe Elimelech in Poland, and the Chernobyl Rebbe in Ukraine. And we find tremendous diversity among these Hasidic masters by 1772. So I told you before that in 1772, the opponents of the Hasidim issued a writ of excommunication. So here's the story of the Hasidic response and the Maggid's passing in that year. It was known that the opponents had issued a writ of excommunication, and an excommunication is a very serious thing. Classically, it's for someone who is sinning publicly or causing harm to the Jewish community, and the community, the court, would excommunicate someone and say, you're not allowed to do business with them, you're not allowed to call them up for a blessing at the Torah, you're not allowed to engage with them in business. They're shunned in the community. It's a last resort for someone who's causing harm to the community. So when the opponents excommunicated the Hasidim, the Maggid and his followers, it was a very, very extreme, intense, dramatic move. The students, according to the story, the students of the Maggid, including many of the masters whose names I've mentioned tonight, gathered together late at night after much discussion amongst themselves to do what Jews often have done in response to collective excommunications, which is to issue a counter excommunication. You can't excommunicate me, I'm excommunicating you first. This is what often happened in Jewish history. So the Hasidim, these future masters, these future Rebbes, got together in the middle of the night, and they were issuing an excommunication of the opponents of the Hasidim. And they were doing it with a ceremony, a Kabbalistic, a mystical ceremony that involves black candles in the middle of the night with imprecations and curses. It's a mystical, spiritual excommunication as well as a political and social excommunication. As they were in the middle of this ceremony, the Great Maggid walked in, limped in, he had a limp. It's known that he had a limp. He limped in to the house of study where they were performing the ceremony. And they all froze, looked at their master, the Maggid, And he looked at them and he said, "You've lost your head. You've lost your head." Now, the simple meaning of this was, you're getting pulled into the argument, you're getting pulled into the controversy. You shouldn't respond. You shouldn't respond. It's just going to feed the fire. Just let it go. It's going to pass. That's the simple meaning. The deeper meaning, though, is that the Maggid passed away later that summer. You've lost your head. You've lost me, because you engaged in this practice of a counter-excommunication, which should not be done. So the Maggid passed away in 1772 in the midst of great conflict between the Hasidim and their opponents, but with his students, the next generation, ready to establish, to spread and share the light of the Baal Shem Tov and the fire that the Baal Shem Tov had ignited and that was fed and stewarded by the Maggid all around Eastern Europe, and each one in his own way. So I want to just spotlight for a few minutes, and then we'll open to your questions. I want to spotlight one of the students of the Maggid. We sang his song, but we haven't really talked about him, Rabbi Yitzchak of Berditchev. Rabbi Yitzchak of Berditchev was one of the younger students of the Maggid, and in Hasidic history, he is very beloved because he is known as the defender of the Jews. It's not the Philip Roth story. It's the actual Hasidic Rebbe who defended the Jews, not against other people and not against non-Jewish attackers or anti-Semitism. Rabbi Yitzchak was known for defending the Jewish people against God. And he was famous for, among other things, judging every person favorably no matter what. And there are many, many stories about this, the way that Rabbi Yitzchak would look at people with such grace and such kindness, giving everyone the benefit of the doubt. So there's a story that he saw a man soon after the morning prayers fixing his wagon wheel, like changing his tire, while still wearing his tefillin, his phylacteries on his arm and on his head. Most rabbis, seeing such a thing, would say, "How dare you wear your phylacteries for such a secular purpose, changing your tire?" Rabbi Yitzchak said, he turned to God, he said, "God, you see, your people, your children are so holy that even when they change their tires, they put on phylacteries. That's how holy they are." Another time, Rabbi Yitzchak saw a famous sinner who was a public sinner. He was known to be a sinner. He desecrated the Sabbath in public, and no one in the community would talk to him. And that man, that sinner, came to synagogue one day, and Rabbi Yitzchak went over to him, and he said, "My brother, you are so close to God." And he said this unironically, you have to understand, completely unironically. He said, "You are so close to God. If I had done all the sins that you've done, I wouldn't be able to go to synagogue. I wouldn't be able to show up at the synagogue. But you, even though you've done all these things, you feel so close to God that you're able to come to synagogue. I envy you." This is Rabbi Yitzchak. And on Yom Kippur, many, many years, Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, the day when God judges us and judges the world, Rabbi Yitzchak would judge God very publicly. And he would call out from the pulpit where he was leading the prayers, "God, today it's your day to judge your people and to judge the world. But today I, Levi Yitzchak, the son of Sarah Sasha, I judge you, God, because look at your people. They're suffering. They're suffering so much. And they're your children. And they don't have to suffer, God. And I know we've sinned. I know, but God, we've also suffered. So I'll tell you what, God, I'll make a deal with you. You forgive us all the sins that we've done, and we will forgive you all the suffering that you've given us." That was the kind of conversation that Rabbi Yitzchak would have with God publicly, over and over again. So there are many stories about him. If we have time, I'll share some more at the end, but I want to pause to hear your questions about the Maggid, about his students, about how Hasidism went from being one person traveling and telling stories to a movement that shaped all of Eastern Europe and far beyond, and continues to shape the Jewish community in many ways today. So Ari, what questions do we have from everyone?
We have a few, and people will chat more, I think, while we talk. So the first is a question I had, which is, do you have a good chart that shows the Baal Shem Tov and all with the dates and then the discipline, the disciples, so we can see all these people? I'm a visual learner, so I would love to see that chart and also the map you showed us of the spread of Hasidism in the different parts of Eastern Europe. So that'd be my first request.
Very fortunately for us, Elie Wiesel created a beautiful map and a beautiful chart. They're both in the book Souls on Fire. I'll hold it up so you can all see it, and we'll send it around again. I actually have I couldn't access it today for some reason, but I have it in my folder somewhere, and I'll send it around so that you can send it around to everyone. So this is from the beginning of Souls on Fire. It's the family tree of Hasidism. I know it's hard to see, but if you zoom in on the root, you'll see the Baal Shem Tov, and you'll see the Maggid, and then you begin to see the primary branches of the movement in the different places where the Maggid sent his students, and then you see the offshoots of each of those. So I'm not going to give you a pop quiz on that because I know it was just a moment and probably hard to see on the screen, but we'll send it around because it is very beautiful. I just want to tell you that in the back of Souls on Fire, Professor Wiesel includes two beautiful things. One I showed you is the map of Eastern Europe. The other is what he calls a synchronology. I've never seen this anywhere else. Synchronology, S-Y-N-K, synchronology. And it's a timeline of the Hasidic world, in the Jewish world in general, what's happening in each year or each period, in the Hasidic world, in the Jewish world, in the world at large, and in the arts. So you can see, for example, who lived at the time of the Napoleonic invasion, or who lived during Rousseau's publication of Emile, or Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, the French Revolution. And it puts Hasidism in context in a way that's very helpful and very, very, very beautiful. So it was an incredibly creative map that you'll find in the back of the book. And I encourage you to buy Souls on Fire. It's my favorite of Professor Wiesel's books. It changed my life when I was 17, 18, 19 years old and continues to today.
Thank you. And I just ordered it actually, so I'll be getting my copy. And I look forward to reading it. People have asked, the stories you're telling us, are they from this book? Are they from a different book? Is there other books where people can read these stories, or an online place they can find them?
There are several really great books. Souls on Fire is the first I could recommend that has a lot of these stories. Martin Buber's Tales of the Hasidim has a lot of these stories. I mentioned this last time in a somewhat more intellectual form or tone. And then there are many stories that are not in English, that are hidden in the backs of Hasidic books, commentaries on the Torah portion usually. And you have to dig for those. But there are plenty of stories available in English. There's also, some of you have mentioned the works of Yitzchak Buxbaum of blessed memory, who just passed away a few weeks ago, who wrote a very beautiful book about the Baal Shem Tov called The Light and Fire of the Baal Shem Tov, as well as other books about the Hasidic masters. There's one called Jewish Tales of Mystic Joy. Professor Wiesel taught that book in a course on Hasidism at Boston University, Jewish Tales of Mystic Joy. And Souls on Fire and Tales of Mystic Joy both include the stories and then a little bit of unpacking of the stories by the author. So it's sort of like walking through this world while your hand is held by a teacher. Those are very beautiful. And then Buber's book, Tales of the Hasidim, has a lot of wonderful stories. You don't have that same kind of guide, that tour guide that you have in these other works.
Our honorees, Martin and Tamar Brower, one of them, or both of them, asked a question: how did these traveling students support themselves? A, and B, they didn't ask this, but I'll ask, was there still one center of Hasidism? I know there were many places of Hasidism, but if you had to say, here is the center with the biggest, most committed group, it was this city. So first of all, how did they support themselves? And second, was there one place where this was the center of Hasidism?
So how do they support themselves? It's different from person to person. Some of them we know had different jobs. The Baal Shem Tov, for example, we know that he was tax exempt. I think I shared this in the last session, because he was known as a doctor, not a medical doctor, but a kind of spiritual shamanic doctor by the town, the non-Jewish town government of Mezritch. And I shared with you that an academic scholar named Moshe Rossman found the tax documents of the town where it says something like Professor Dr. Baal Shem, and he's tax exempt. And he was paid for his services. A lot of the masters, a lot of the rebbes would receive donations from their followers. The follower would come and give a certain amount of money, and the rebbe would give a blessing. And at first, this was actually a mystical practice, and the amount of money corresponded to the thing that the person needed. There's a whole kind of science, mystical science, of the exchange of money for spiritual redemptions and blessings.
By the way, CSP does that too. $180, you get one blessing, and if you commit more money to CSP, you get other blessings. I want to make sure people know that.
The only thing is, Ari, you have to be able to look at people's foreheads and see all of their past lives and all the things that they need the blessing for.
We do that on Zoom now.
Okay, perfect. So that was one way. Sometimes the wife of the Rebbe supported the family. This is certainly not an egalitarian society. We're talking about Eastern Europe. For the most part, it was men who were the Rebbes. There are exceptions, and I hope we'll get to some of those exceptions. There were several female Rebbes, but they were really exceptional. I mentioned the Baal Shem Tov's daughter and her daughter, but for the most part, that was not the case. And then sometimes the Rebbes had a store, a grocery store, or an inn. And sometimes they lived in poverty for several years, or sometimes for a long time. And some of them became wanderers and traveled the back roads of Eastern Europe in order to experience the exile that God experiences in the world. God is a stranger in the world. And they wanted to experience that sense of being lost and homeless. So they deliberately lived in abject poverty, like saints in other traditions sometimes did, as a spiritual practice. Over time, the practice of receiving money for blessings became more entrenched and formalized, and in some places has been criticized for being transactional. And we could think about what is the role of a religious leader, and should the community support spiritual leaders who give spiritual blessing of any sort to the community, and how should that interaction work? That's a conversation that shows up in later Hasidism. And sorry, Ari, what was the other question?
Is there one place that you would say is the
Right.
central town of Hasidism?
So there was, until the passing of the Maggid. That's exactly what we're talking about tonight. Until 1772, Mezritch was the place. Before that, it was Mezritch. So everyone say Mezritch, Mezritch. It's not even the hardest town to pronounce. We'll get there.
And these are all in the Ukraine, correct?
Ukraine, Poland, I mean, the borders changed all the time. Ukraine, Poland, White Russia, Galicia later, but Poland basically. I mean, in the foothills of the Carpathian Mountains, Mezritch is where the Baal Shem Tov was. That was the acknowledged capital of the Hasidic world. Then it moved to Mezritch, and moved north to Mezritch. But when the Maggid died, and now there were centers in Lublin and in Apt and in Chernobyl and many other places, there was no single center. That was one of the things that made the movement so successful. Because if there's one center, it's unstable. If something happens to that center, for example, let's say there's a center and then the successor, the next leader in that place is not dynamic, is not charismatic, the whole movement suffers. But if you've decentralized and now you've got centers all over the place, then you have tremendous diversity, different kinds of expressions of spirituality, different kinds of teachers and different kinds of charisma and different kinds of dynamics. And it's much more stable, much more vibrant, and that's what happened. So from 1772 and on, next time we're going to see the life of a master who was born that same year. Rabbi Nachman of Breslov was born in 1772, the year that the Maggid passed away. 1772 is a really critical moment in the life of Hasidism for several reasons. we'll see that he entered a world that was already very different with multiple centers, and it was taken for granted that every town and most villages would have a Hasidic center, a Hasidic Rebbe. Some of them were the children of the previous Rebbe, the sons-in-law, the grandchildren, the students, and you couldn't walk 4 steps without tripping over a Hasidic master by 1780 or so. And that was seen as a great thing for the Hasidim, and by the opponents, it was seen as a terrible, terrible infestation of mysticism and revivalism and charismatic leadership.
Let's talk about the charismatic leaders, the Rebbes, but because Jeff Kaufman has had a question last time, and this time we didn't address it last time. We'll address it this time, but let's call it the cult of the Rebbe. The Rebbe, I mean, even you described, they got money for blessings. They were the access point maybe to God for the community. The community is built around them. So in many ways, wouldn't you say that there is this cult aspect to a Rebbe, which is my question. Then Jeff's question is, he wanted you to compare the Rebbe to like the Zen masters in the East and their techniques of thought and contemplation, and whether there is any connection between the two, or they just randomly, they developed separately, but they are similar, or maybe they're dissimilar.
So first I'll tell you, there's a great book that's a little hard to find called, I think it's called Zen and Hasidism. And it's a comparison of Zen Buddhism and Hasidism. And I read it many years ago. I don't have it. And I'm not sure it's easy to find nowadays, but it's a great, great book. And there are other thinkers who continue that train of thought, comparing the two disciplines. There are a lot of commonalities. There are a lot of parallels. And one of the things that's, I've talked a lot about the diversity of the Hasidic movement and the diversity of the Rebbes. So there were Rebbes, there were masters who emphasized the role of the Rebbe, the role of the tzaddik, the role of the righteous person who's the leader, perhaps the opener of the gateway to heaven or to spiritual experience. And there certainly were Rebbes like that. There were also Rebbes, and we'll see one of them next time, and we'll talk about another 2 times from now. There were Rebbes who de-emphasized that role. There were Rebbes who said, it's not really about the charismatic leader. It's really about you following certain practices and developing yourself spiritually. And the Rebbe is a teacher, perhaps a guide, but certainly not an intermediary. So you find a great diversity among the Hasidic world then and also today. I have met people, I've known people well, friends and acquaintances who follow Rebbes today, and the primary expression of their discipleship, of their relationship with their Rebbe, is that they will ask the Rebbe questions like, which job should I take? Or who should I marry? Or where should I live? And even today, there are Rebbes who give advice about those very concrete, specific things. And there are other Rebbes who would laugh at you if you ask such questions. Because who am I to tell you what to do? You're a person, you figure it out. I can tell you how to pray. I can teach you how to meditate. I can teach you how to discern the true inner voice from all the other voices that are distracting you from yourself. But I can't tell you what to do. Even if I know, even if I have the Holy Spirit and I really do know, it's not my job to tell you because I'll be interfering with your personhood. So you find great diversity there. In some places, it's probably the case that the charismatic leadership took on some trappings that were problematic. And there's a test for this. And by the way, in Hasidism, there are many stories of, and we've seen some of them already, there are many stories of the beginning of the relationship between master and disciple. But in Hasidism, the master doesn't choose the disciple chooses the master. The disciple chooses the Rebbe. So there are many stories of, we saw one tonight, the student who came to the Maggid and wanted to test him. We saw the Maggid came to the Baal Shem Tov and wanted to test him. Many, many stories of the student coming in with skepticism to see, is this my Rebbe or not? And we have stories of people going from master to master, from Rebbe to Rebbe, until finally they feel that connection and find that this is the person who can help me. This is the person who can teach me and help me to grow. In Zen Buddhism, there's often the same kind of dynamic where there's not a substitution of power in the best of cases for the practice itself. You have to sit That's the ultimate answer is you have to sit in meditation. But of course, in Zen Buddhism, we also do find some of the excesses, charismatic leaders who took advantage of their followers. There are all kinds of scandals. So charisma is dangerous and charismatic leadership is dangerous. And in Hasidism, the dangers were less pronounced than in other, as far as I know, were less pronounced than in some of the other stories you hear about cult leaders, certainly, or even some Zen Buddhist masters who took advantage of their students. We don't find that same kind of thing in general in Hasidism. And the reason for that is that all the masters were equally committed to Jewish law, with a few very small exceptions. And the exceptions were in matters like praying the morning service later than you're supposed to. That was one of the big controversies in later Hasidism, was some of the masters started praying late. That was like the worst it got, was, they prayed late. But in general, they were very committed to Jewish law, and Jewish law can protect from some of those excesses that you find in some other places. But nevertheless, one of the main points of controversy within Hasidism was, what should the role of the Rebbe, the master, be? Should it be a charismatic leader who is an intermediary? Do I need to rely on the master or the tzaddik, the righteous man, or the leader for my spiritual life? Or is the master teaching and it's really up to me? So I'll just end with when the last Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson, was asked by the Hasidim, by the Lubavitcher Hasidim, to become the Rebbe. There's a famous story about this, that he refused, and they worked on him for a year. They begged him for an entire year to take over the movement, and he didn't want to. And there are stories of him weeping at night because he didn't want to be the Rebbe. And finally he said, okay, fine, I'll be the Rebbe, but you need to know that you are not going to ride on my coattails. Every one of you has to do the work. We're all in this together. And that was one of the things I think that that characterizes a great teacher. A mediocre teacher, a mediocre master wants you to be like him or her. A great teacher wants you to be yourself. And the best of the masters were those whose students were very different than the master, who found another way of expressing their own spiritual intuitions and developing their own spiritual paths. And to bring this full circle, that's what we see with the Maggid. None of his students imitated him. They all carried on in a very, very different way than their teacher, and he would have loved that. That was his message. You all have to find your own way.
We have time just for a few more questions, but three people asked basically the same question. I think it's Debbie, Pat, and Marilyn. And they wanted to know whether in today's Hasidic world, is Chabad the only one that continues this idea of shlichut, sending their messengers out to create sub-communities around the world? And if so, why only them? Why not the other, even bigger, way bigger Hasidic groups that are still around today? Why do they not do it?
It's a great question, and certainly Chabad is the one that expresses this idea in the most aggressive way and committed way. And in fact, it would be a really interesting study and maybe someone has done it, comparing the modern model of shlichus, of mission or messengership in Lubavitch to the Maggid's original sending out of students to establish communities around Eastern Europe. In fact, I suspect that was the model for the Lubavitcher Rebbe's activities in this regard, but it requires more study to see if that's correct. It's pretty much only Lubavitch. There are other Hasidic groups that establish schools and networks within the Haredi world, within the ultra-Orthodox world. But Chabad is unique in sending people out not only to the ultra-Orthodox world and not only to the Orthodox world, but all around the world, wherever there's even a single Israeli backpacker, in Thailand or somewhere, Dharamsala, there will be a Chabad house. And that's one of the commitments of Lubavitchers, which is, stunning. You can go pretty much anywhere in the world and find kosher food or find a class if you want to do some learning or whatever you need. And also other things that are not Jewish. If you just need support or a place to stay, they will support, anyone who's passing through. And the reason for that is that Hasidism in general became much more inwardly focused and insular as a response to first modernity and the Enlightenment, and second, especially to the Holocaust. The rebuilding of Hasidic communities was the primary focus of Hasidic communities that survived it all, that survived the Holocaust. They wanted to rebuild their communities, and rather than turn outward and think about outreach, they looked inward. As an aside, we do find that kind of model of sending people out to establish new communities in the later Musar movement, which is 100 years later from our time. We're talking about 1772. About 100 years later, give or take, we find a movement among the Lithuanians, among the opponents of the Hasidim, who say, you know, guess what? Intellectual study isn't enough. We need to focus on character as well. So we find the rise of a new movement, which is sometimes called the Lithuanian response to Hasidism, which is a real focus on character development. And there you find teachers and leaders who are also very strategic about sending people out to establish new centers. Many of the large academies in Israel today are descended from those centers that were created by the Musar rabbis following the Hasidic model to establish new centers everywhere and build a movement very consciously. So you don't find that generally in the Hasidic world, but think about what's possible. A small group of people who are dedicated to some ideals and some practices and culture to support those ideals. Imagine what's possible if we are strategic in training people and then sending them out into the world. Imagine what's possible. Imagine the impact that a small group of people can have to make the world more compassionate, more spiritual, whatever the emphasis is. It's a model we can turn to. And the model of the Maggot of Mezaridge is a model that for many years has inspired me to think about how to make change in the world. Because he did. He took some inspiration and he made something that had staying power with tremendous rigorous strategy without losing the spark of the initial inspiration.
Have you traveled at all to the Ukraine and to any of these places of historic import to Hasidism?
I have. For many years, I traveled on Rosh Hashanah, on the Jewish New Year, to the grave of Rabbi Nachman. We're going to talk about Rabbi Nachman of Breslov next time. And that's Rabbi Nachman's path is the path that I'm most inspired by and that I try to follow in my life, that really drives my own religious journey, my Jewish journey. And so I've traveled to Ukraine for over 20 years, once a year. And
that's Uman.
That's Uman, right? And usually I go to Uman, but some years I've gone to Uman and also to Mezhibazh and Berdichev and Breslov. So Mezhibazh is where the Baal Shem Tov is buried, remember? We saw the Hasidim singing there at his gravesite in that little house in Mezhibazh. So I've been there, and Rabbi Yitzchak of Berdichev, whose song we sang tonight and we spoke about a little at the end, is buried in Berdichev. Interestingly, they discovered just this year, a few months ago, that he's buried in the building where they thought he was buried, but it's not exactly where they thought he was. Everyone thought that it was on one side of the room. It turns out he was buried in the center of the room, and all these people have been like praying or meditating in the wrong spot. This is a classic Hasidic humorous historical moment. But a lot of people travel to those places, and Ari, I know that you've been working on virtual tours of those places, and it's really worth having some contact there, because you start to see the stories come to life. You see the landscape, you see some places still, you see the peasant going by in a wagon. There's more and more modernity. When I started traveling to Ukraine, there was nothing really modern about it. There was barely an airport. And then over time, we start to see a KFC or an IKEA, or a TGI Fridays in Kiev. But still, when you're on the back roads or between towns or villages, you feel like you're 200 years ago. You feel like you've traveled back in time, and the stories have a different flavor. The stories you've heard really start to come to life.
I was talking to Professor Justin Cami, who's one of our CSP scholars. He's at Smith College, and he's going to come back for a 5-part series in February. And he wants to do a trip where we go to Lithuania and the Ukraine and Belarus. So maybe we'll take you with us.
I'd love that.
Okay. Jeff Kaufman points out that things go around. So he thinks maybe the Mormons learned from the Hasidim, because they're the ones that do the shlichut pretty well right now. So I always thought, if you've seen Book of Mormon, which I don't know if I can recommend to a rabbi, the musical Book of Mormon, but I always thought for a Purim spiel, it'd be great if they did it for Hasidim, answering the door. And handing out the good word. I just thought that'd be a great thing. Okay, last question or two. Do you have you spent time with the Hasidic, any Hasidic movements in the United States? And can you share some experiences from that?
I'll share one experience. It's important to say, and maybe we'll talk about this in the last session, that there are many people who are deeply influenced and inspired by Hasidism who don't live in Hasidic communities. And part of what's happened with the teachings and the songs and the stories of Hasidism is that they've become accessible to others through these books in English and all kinds of other ways. And, Professor Wiesel once said to a student, you don't have to be a Hasid to be a Hasid. You don't have to live in a Hasidic community to be a Hasid. You can connect to these teachings and these tales and really live them very deeply, integrate, internalize these ideas and practices in your life, wherever you are, whichever part of the Jewish community or other communities you're a part of. So I think that's a very powerful and beautiful development. That's an extension of the Maggid's dream, right? And the Baal Shem Tov's dream. They started in a very small area. It's spread across Eastern Europe, but now it's not limited to Eastern Europe. It's not even primarily there. It's wherever there are people with access to books or even online resources. And that's a really powerful thing. So I have spent time with Hasidim in the States in several different ways and contexts, but I'll just give you one story. I was with a friend of mine in a small shtibel, a small synagogue near your place on the Upper West Side, 91st Street between West End and Riverside is Rav Vorhan's shtibel. And it's a very sweet little shul. Mostly Hasidim pray there. And we were there on, I think it was Rosh Chodesh, like it is tonight. It's the new moon, the beginning of a new month, a new Hebrew month. And my friend Charlie and I were there studying in the small room off the main sanctuary. And while we're studying, suddenly 3 very large Hasidim wearing all black burst into the room, and they say, "Hey, we're going to New Square to the Rebbe's Tish. You want to come?" They're going to New Square. New Square is a fascinating sociological phenomenon of a Hasidic community, a Hasidic town that's incorporated as a Hasidic town. There's a lot to say about that town, some problematic things, some positive things, but it's a very interesting, strange, modern model of a Hasidic town where the police officers are Hasidic and the firefighters are Hasidic. Everything is Hasidic. It was founded as a Hasidic town in north of New York City. We're going to the Tish. The Tish is the celebration with the Rebbe. Do you want to come? So we looked at each other and shrugged and said, sure, why not? And we found ourselves hurtling up the West Side Highway. Hasidim drive really fast, apparently. And we found our way to New Square. And my friend and I were wearing jeans and flannel shirts. We were not dressed for a Hasidic occasion. And we walk into a room that looks like it's about the size of a small stadium. And on the sides of the room, there are bleachers from floor to ceiling, bleachers filled with hundreds of Hasidim. And in the center of the room, there's a long table with a white tablecloth. And the Rebbe, the Skvera Rebbe, who's descended from the Chernobyl Hasidic dynasty, the first Chernobyl Rebbe was a student of the Maggid. And the Rebbe sitting at the head of the table with some elder Hasidim around him at the table with a white tablecloth. And the Rebbe, interestingly, for Kabbalistic reasons, has his left hand under the tablecloth. He won't pick his left hand above the table because in mysticism, the left represents the side of judgment and the right represents the side of love and compassion. So he never picks his left hand above the table, but his right hand is above the table and he's hitting the table in rhythm and everyone is singing. Hundreds and hundreds of Hasidim in the bleachers, all wearing black, are singing, and we go into the bleachers and we are 2 points of denim blue against the backdrop of black Hasidim. And what happens at a Tish is they sing and the Rebbe says Torah. The Rebbe gives a little sermon or lesson, or a long one sometimes. And then the Rebbe, in some Hasidic circles, not every Hasidic circle, sometimes the Rebbe will do an old mystical practice where they will bring the Rebbe food, and the Rebbe will take a bite of the food onto his own plate, and then the rest of the food, by virtue of its being in proximity to the Rebbe, is now somehow blessed, and they give out pieces of that food to everyone in the room. It's called shirayim, literally leftovers. You're eating the righteous person's leftovers. I never connected to this custom so much. It's not something that they do in Breslov, but they did it here. But here's the thing. Here's like the spiritual, technological challenge of this moment. So we're all on bleachers, right? Hundreds of people are in bleachers, and they're handing out plates of chicken and a plastic fork and knife. And the chicken is like on the bone. So there's no table. So how are we going to cut the chicken and eat it? So first of all, they serve me and my friend first before any of the Hasidim, because we're strangers, we're guests. Beautiful hospitality. They serve us first. We notice this. The Hasid next to me is a short Hasid. He looks a little bit like Woody Allen dressed as a Hasid. I forget which movie it's from, where he suddenly looks like a Hasidic Jew. But this Hasid actually looks like Woody Allen physically, and he's short, and he's wearing all black. And he looks up at me and he says, "Put your chicken on my hands. I'll be your table. I'll be your table." And he holds my chicken so I can cut my chicken on the plate, because otherwise there's no way to do it because I'm on a bleacher. And then I noticed that everyone is doing that for the person next to him. They're all serving each other in that way, with beautiful hospitality and a lot of sweetness. So this is a Hasidic group that, I personally am less connected to. Historically, it's not a Hasidic group that I have any roots or relationship with, but it was a very striking moment of hospitality to outsiders, which for many of us, and for me at the time, was surprising. Because you think, well, if we're coming in from the outside, maybe they'll judge us, maybe they won't accept us because we're not as religious as they are, or whatever it is. But remember that the Rebbe's left hand was under the table. It was a place committed to leaning towards the side of kindness and compassion and love. That was what that Hasidic group was dedicated to. And then at the end, they gave us the book of the founder of that movement, the original Chernobyl Rebbe, which I still have. That was one moment, one experience of American modern Hasidic life that took place about, 20 years ago. There are many more stories I could tell you, but I'll stop there for now.
Thank you for sharing that. Can we end where we started with a nigun, or just, you don't have to sing necessarily, but can you tell us from your experience, since everything is kind of tied into Elie Wiesel this month as well, did he have a favorite melody that he shared with you?
He had a favorite melody, and he said it was the melody that was in his mind at that moment. Because he said he always had a melody in his head. He always had a melody in his head, no matter where he was. He told me that when he was in the White House, he had a Hasidic melody usually in his head. When he was at the United Nations, when he was at the opening of the Holocaust Museum, he always had a melody, a Hasidic melody in his head. So when he told me this, I said, which melody is in your head now? And he told me it was a Simchat Torah melody. Eile Chamda Libi. I don't know which tune he meant. I want to find out. I don't know if he meant the one that I'm familiar with or a different older Hasidic one. But he always had a melody in his head, and that was his favorite melody in that moment, because one of the secret teachings of Hasidic melodies is that there's not one melody for every occasion. You have to know what the moment is. Is it a moment of longing? Is it a moment of yearning? Is it a moment of excitement? Is it a moment of overcoming obstacles? Is it a moment to connect to the teachings of the Berditchever, or the Vishnitzer, or the Breslover Rebbe, or the Chernobyl Rebbe? You have to know what's on the menu and what's appropriate for you in this moment. And that's one of the central teachings of the Baal Shem Tov, if you remember, that nothing is cookie cutter. Every moment is new. Every one of us is different. Not only is every one of us different, but each of us is different in every moment. And every hour, every moment of the day has its own spiritual energy and unique opportunity. And we have to stay awake and alert to those opportunities. So when we find ourselves looking, and I'll end with this, because the Maggid was the great organizer. It would have been so easy to take the teachings of the Baal Shem Tov and make them fixed and a kind of conformist model now of Hasidism. the Magid was able to strategically organize and place a powerfully growing, successful movement without losing the nonconformity, without losing the particularity and the diversity and the spontaneity of the movement. And that is an incredible accomplishment. You don't find that usually with revolutionary movements. You find a revolutionary movement that becomes fixed and becomes the new kind of bureaucratic establishment. Next time we're going to see that, having said that, there are revolutions against the Hasidic establishment a generation or two later. We're going to start to explore that next time. But in general, the Hasidic movement maintained that openness for a long time. Not forever. It changed a lot with the confrontation with modernity and then even more with the Holocaust and the devastation of Hasidic communities, especially in Poland. But for 3 or so generations after the Magid, you find this tremendous diversity and excitement, nonconformity. You could travel from one town to the next and suddenly be in a completely different spiritual context and path, but it's still Jewish. Everyone agrees with the basics of Judaism, but the emphasis is completely different. So it's sort of the moment in Jewish history when we had perhaps the greatest, most extensive menu of spiritual yummy items to consume, to order, without feeling like you were forced to choose one and be consistently in that path for life. You could develop, the melody can change, the melody needs to change, and we need to ask over and over again, what's the melody for this occasion and for this moment?
Thank you. So we'll end there. We hopefully will see everybody back tomorrow, 12:30 p.m. Pacific, 3:30 Eastern, 2:30 Central. Tales of Conflict and Wrestling with Sacred Text Part 2. Then you get a break for Shabbat, and we'll see you back on Sunday for The Life and Legacy of Elie Wiesel Part 2. So that's it, guys. Have a great evening. You got lots to read. You got a lot of stuff to look up, a lot of rabbis and disciples to check out. And I'll try to find some, and a book to order at your local bookstore. And we'll try to find maybe we'll share another musical, site on the internet, which captures one of these nigunim that you wanted to share. Maybe the Berdichev nigun that we started with. Okay, everybody. That's all. Have a good one.
Bye,
Take
everyone.
care.
Well, we'll see you soon.
Keep well. Keep safe. Get your vaccines if you can. Ariel, I'll talk to you later. Bye.
Okay, bye-bye.